Have you ever considered that the texts that shaped Christianity and influenced billions over the centuries might have been as human as they were divine? What if I told you that the Bible, as we know it today, did not fall ready-made from the sky, but was carefully shaped and even manipulated by human hands? Behind each accepted chapter, there is a hidden story of exclusions and adjustments, a true game of power and control. How would you feel to discover that some of the most profound and spiritual texts were erased like Mary Magdalene's or Jude's simply because they didn't align with the desired narrative? In this video, we will explore not only the beginning of where the Bible began to be written and translated, but a secret that few dare to question: how the holy books were chosen and why others were censored or persecuted. It is a story of heated debates, political decisions, and, above all, an effort to shape spirituality according to very specific interests. This isn't just a dive into history. It is an invitation to rediscover what was left behind and question the foundations of what we were taught as absolute. Follow every detail, as this knowledge can transform your view of spirituality and open doors to a deeper understanding of what is hidden in the shadows of history. And of course, take the opportunity to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. And be sure to stay until the end, because after everything that will be revealed, you will have a very important choice to make. Imagine a world where memory was the only book available, and stories were as alive as the breath of those who told them. This was how the ancients transmitted their wisdom. There were no parchments or ink. What there were voices, intonations, and gestures. By the light of the fires, words flowed from generation to generation, shaped by the winds of time. But like every wireless telephone, each narrator adjusted the story to suit his audience. What was said was not just one truth, but several simultaneous, flexible, and, above all, human truths. Isn't it curious that the words we consider immutable today were born from this creative instability? Good. When the writing finally came, the game changed. Think of writing as a golden prison for words, freezing them in time, but also wresting them from the malleability of orality. What was collective and dynamic became restricted and static. Now imagine the scene. Scribes with quills in their hands, sitting in silent halls, deciding the fate of sacred history. Every word written was a decision: what to include, what to cut, what to emphasize. The question is, to what extent were they faithful to what they heard? Or did they take advantage of the silence to adjust the stories to their own interests? After all, whoever controls the pen controls the narrative, right? And another detail would not be the first time that excluded knowledge helped maintain the power of a few. And let's not ignore the exclusivity of writing in those times. The ability to record stories was not for everyone. It was a privilege reserved for the few who knew how to decipher those mysterious symbols. Can you imagine the size of a scribe's influence in a society where almost no one knew how to read? These men were more than scribes. They were curators of memory, but also its censors. By deciding what to record, they determined what would be remembered and, more importantly, what would be forgotten. Forbidden knowledge? Perhaps, but it was certainly knowledge that was controlled and often pursued. Now let's move on to practice. When the first records began to emerge, there was no consensus on what was sacred or not. Each community had its own stories, its own divine manuals. Someone in the 21st century could even compare this to a decentralized internet, where each group created its own information bubble. But unlike the internet, writing did not allow for instantaneous debates. The engraved words were seen as final, almost like divine decrees. Here's the trick. If writing gave a sense of immutability, imagine the impact of tweaking it before making it official. Did you think about manipulation? Well, you are not alone. What about the historical relevance of all this? Let's look at the cultural changes of that time. When writing began to dominate, it not only preserved stories, but also created barriers. Whoever held the written records had access to power over the past, present, and future. Orality gave freedom to stories. Writing gave control. It was here that hidden knowledge began to take shape, that which was restricted to a few and kept out of the reach of the common people. The sarcasm of the situation? Good texts that were written to preserve faith have become tools of exclusion. What was accessible to everyone became a privilege for a few. There is yet another intriguing aspect. The idea that written texts have acquired the status of absolute truth. Something curious, considering that not all scribes were exactly concerned with historical accuracy. Imagine the following scenario. A tired scribe, with a melting candle at his side, decides to simplify a complicated passage because it's too late, and he has another order the next day. Does it seem trite? Perhaps. But each of these adjustments shape what we understand as sacred today. And if it doesn't make you question the nature of what you consider divine, maybe you're not paying enough attention. And of course, this transition did not happen uniformly. Different people, with different traditions, resisted the idea of fixing their stories on parchment. For many, writing was like stealing the soul of the word, making it something dead. But pragmatism won. In the fight between oral fluidity and the permanence of writing, the latter emerged victorious, but with a victory full of asterisks. After all, who guarantees that the written versions were the best or most faithful? Every line recorded was a line of suppressed stories, a trail of forbidden knowledge left behind. Finally, we cannot ignore the cultural impact of this transition. Writing brought legitimacy and permanence, but it also centralized control of narratives. This paved the way for something that would soon become a bigger problem: the proliferation of texts vying for the title, sacred. As you can imagine, when there are many candidates, mess is inevitable. But this is a story we will see next, where the sacred mess will take shape and challenge everything we know about the biblical texts. In the first centuries of Judeo-Christian history, things were far from being organized as they are today. Imagine a time when there was no single holy book to follow, but dozens, perhaps hundreds of texts circulating among communities. Each group had its own collection of scriptures, like personalized playlists. Some communities swore by the Torah. Others had the Dead Sea Scrolls as the basis of their faith, while others embraced gospels now considered lost, such as those of Thomas and Mary. It was like a divine popularity contest, where the most spiritual text didn't always win. And what about censored or deleted stories? These still make us scratch our heads. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, are living proof of this diversity. Discovered in caves by chance, or perhaps by providence, these manuscripts showed that Jewish faith in the Second Temple period was a veritable patchwork. There were prayers, rules of conduct, prophecies, and even apocalyptic texts that made it seem like the world could end at any moment. Sound familiar? What is intriguing here is that many of these writings were not even close to the final versions of the Bible. They simply remained behind, relics of a time when spiritual diversity was seen as a wealth rather than a threat. In early Christianity, the situation was even more chaotic. There were gospels for all tastes. The Gospel of Thomas, with its mystical approach, was a favorite among those seeking a deeper, hidden understanding of Jesus. The Gospel of Mary presented a bold perspective, giving protagonism to a female figure in a world dominated by men. And what about the Gospel of Judas? He completely flipped the script by portraying Judas not as a traitor, but as an essential ally to Jesus' plan. Isn't it curious how quickly these texts were persecuted and silenced? It seems that forbidden knowledge had a high price for those who dared to explore it. And here comes the most controversial point: how to decide what was inspired by God and what was just a human invention. The truth is that this decision was not as heavenly as we would like to believe. Religious leaders at the time began to realize that allowing a diversity of texts was a recipe for doctrinal chaos. And chaos, let's face it, is terrible for those who want to consolidate power. Thus began a slow and deliberate exclusion of writings that did not fit the official narrative. The sarcasm of the situation? Texts that were loved by entire communities were discarded as dangerous. Dangerous for whom? Exactly? That's the big question. With so much going around, it's no wonder some leaders decided it was time to bring order to the house. But before you think this was a selfless effort to preserve the purity of the faith, let's remember that politics has always had a seat at the table. When it comes to power, diversity has never been welcome. This is where the concept of sacred mess takes shape. The attempt to organize the texts was, in many ways, an attempt to control the flow of ideas and silence dissenting voices. After all, isn't it much easier to govern when everyone is reading the same manual? The problem is that, to create a single manual, many stories needed to be forgotten, and they were for a long time. And with that, we arrive at the next chapter of this saga. Who had the power to write and revise these texts? Who decided what should be adjusted, softened, or strengthened? It is in this transition from proliferation to exclusion that we begin to see human hands shaping the divine word. And the decisions made by these scribes still echo today, shaping what we call faith. In a world where almost no one knew how to read or write, scribes were the true masters of words. Imagine the power of being one of the few people able to turn stories into permanent records, especially at a time when paper, or parchment, in this case, was almost as valuable as gold. These scribes were not just anonymous workers. They were the guardians of knowledge, and at the same time, its shapers. Every word they wrote or omitted could change the course of a story, or even the fate of an entire community. It is no exaggeration to say that these men, with their pens and ink, carried a divine power disguised as humility. And of course, with great power comes the opportunity for manipulation. Writing sacred texts was a highly responsible task, but also fraught with temptation. After all, who would question the scribe if he decided to improve a passage or adjust a detail to please whoever was paying for the service? It was common for religious leaders to hire scribes to record stories that reinforced their own theological interpretations. And let's not be naive. There were no cameras or microphones to document the process. The scribe was alone with his creativity and, at times, his ambition. Thus, subtle adjustments emerged, and others, while not so subtle, that shaped the narrative of the Bible as we know it today. Think, for example, of additions made to reinforce certain doctrines. Many scholars suggest that some verses that glorify the authority of the church or condemn heresies were added later. Somewhat curiously, this is not true. A famous case is the passage known as Comma Johanneum, which reinforces the idea of the Trinity. Studies indicate that this excerpt was inserted centuries after the first texts. If this isn't a form of censored knowledge being surreptitiously introduced, I don't know what is. And here's the irony. These changes, made to protect the purity of the faith, ended up exposing how vulnerable the scriptures were to human interference. The copyist monks of the Middle Ages were other important actors in this story. They worked in isolated monasteries, copying manuscripts for hours on end, often in grueling conditions. Between a break for stale bread and a candle about to go out, it was not uncommon for errors to be introduced into the texts. Some monks, frustrated with the monotony of the work, even wrote marginal notes that ended up being confused with the original text in subsequent copies. An innocent oversight? Perhaps, but the impact of these failures was immense, altering the meaning of entire passages. Who knew an exhausted monk's pen could be so powerful? And then we have the translators, who also played a crucial role in this power play. When texts were translated into new languages, the word choices made by translators often reflected their own interpretations and biases. A classic example is the translation of the Hebrew word soul as spirit in some contexts, which completely changed the meaning of certain passages. These linguistic nuances are not just technical details. They shaped the way entire generations understood their faith. Whoever controls the language controls the mind, and in this case, also the heart. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. These scribes, monks, and translators not only shaped the texts, they shaped the very vision of the divine. They decided which stories would be celebrated and which would be forgotten. But there was a growing problem. The diversity of interpretations and texts was becoming unsustainable. It was necessary to bring order to chaos. And so, we entered the era of councils, where religious leaders decided the final fate of sacred texts. But we will see this soon, where power will become even more centralized and decisions more political than ever before. Imagine early Christianity as a chaotic marketplace, where every preacher was a seller of ideas, and each community had its own trademark of Jesus. For some, he was an enlightened spiritual master. For others, a political revolutionary. And for some, something far beyond our understanding. It was a true theological fair, with interpretations competing for space. And that may sound liberating, but for emerging faith leaders, it was a nightmare. After all, how could you consolidate a movement if no one even agreed on who the protagonist was? This apparently spiritual struggle for control hid much more earthly interests. In the first centuries, Christianity did not have a single face. Communities spread across the Mediterranean followed their own traditions and gospels, many of which are now outside the canon. Think of the Gospel of Thomas with its enigmatic maxims, almost as if Jesus were a Stoic philosopher, or in the Gospel of Mary, which placed a woman as a central figure in the understanding of divine messages. The image of a woman as a spiritual leader, somewhat controversial for that time, don't you think? And not to mention that there was the Gospel of Judas, which turned everything upside down by portraying Judas as an accomplice, not a traitor. Texts like these were persecuted and discarded for challenging what Christian leaders wanted to establish as the single truth. But why this exclusion? The reason was not only theological, but also political. The Roman Empire was a centralizing force, and a divided religion was just what its rulers didn't need. When Christianity began to gain adherents in Rome, it became clear that doctrinal diversity was a risk. Imagine ruling an empire and having to deal with internal sects debating whether Jesus was human, divine, or something in between. Theological unity came to be seen as a practical necessity. But what was needed to create this unity? Much more than simple faith. Texts that did not align with what we now call orthodoxy were labeled as heretical. And being a heretic back then was practically a spiritual and sometimes literal death sentence. What many forget is that these heretics did not see themselves as deviant. For them, their interpretations were as valid as the others. The struggle for control, then, was not just a question of who was right or wrong, but of who had the most power to impose their vision. And in this dispute, excluded knowledge was more of a victim than a villain. And the most ironic? Many of the ideas considered heretical at that time were based on profound interpretations and, in some cases, more aligned with the Jewish origins of Christianity. But these nuances were suppressed in the name of the purity of faith. It was in this environment that Christian leaders began to realize the need to make official decisions about which texts would be considered sacred. But for that, they would need something more formal, something that involved not only faith, but also politics. And so we entered the era of great councils, where the Christian narrative would begin to be definitively shaped. Imagine a room filled with men in heavy robes, lit only by flickering candles. There were no microphones, but the voices were loud and the discussions heated. This was the setting for the great Christian councils, meetings that would decide nothing less than the fate of faith. Names like Nicaea, Hippo, and Carthage still resonate as milestones in religious history. But few know that these events were not just moments of pure spirituality. They were, above all, political maneuvers, a carefully choreographed dance between temporal and eternal power. The image of leaders debating with reverence hides something much more human: ambition, rivalry, and a good dose of pragmatism. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is perhaps the most famous. Summoned by Emperor Constantine, His main mission was to resolve the controversy over the nature of Jesus. Was he fully divine, fully human, or a mixture of the two? It may seem like a harmless theological debate, but the implications were immense. Deciding this meant shaping the basis of Christian belief and, more importantly, ensuring unity within the Roman Empire. Constantine was not a theologian. He was a political strategist. For him, a unified Christianity was the key to a stable empire. Thus, while the bishops discussed doctrines, he was more concerned with avoiding a spiritual civil war. What many forget is that not all bishops agreed with Nicaea's decisions. The discussions were so intense that some leaders refused to sign the final documents. And what happened to them? They were labeled as heretics and banished. This makes it clear that these councils were not just about discovering divine truth, but also about silencing dissent. The process of selecting which texts would be considered inspired involved much more politics than prayer. Ask yourself, how many of the decisions that shaped your faith were truly inspired by God, and how many were guided by the need for control? In addition to Nicaea, other councils followed, each adding new layers of decision and exclusion. In Hippo 393 and Carthage in 397 and 419, as an example, leaders finally decided the biblical canon, that is, which books would be included in the Bible and which would be discarded. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas and Mary were eliminated, not because they were less spiritual, but because they did not align with the narrative that the church wanted to promote. The sarcasm here is inevitable. Books that for centuries fed the faith of entire communities were erased with a stroke of a pen, while others, more convenient, were exalted as sacred. So the question remains, were the other texts not spiritual, or did it put the control of power at risk? And of course, there was an element of dirty diplomacy in these encounters. Political interests were so intertwined with religious decisions that it is almost impossible to separate them. Many of the excluded texts presented ideas that threatened the power structure of the church and the empire. The role of women, for example, was often downgraded, while images of a more human and accessible Jesus were suppressed. The deletion of these texts was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice to consolidate a single narrative. And so, what we know today as the Bible began to take shape, a masterpiece of spirituality, but also of manipulation. But the story doesn't end here. Even after the councils, the Bible would continue to be revised, translated, and reinterpreted over the centuries. What appeared to be a final decision was, in fact, just the beginning of an ongoing process of adjustments and deletions. And this leads us to an essential question. If the Bible was shaped by human hands, what was lost in this process? To answer this, we need to look more closely at the texts that were left out. And that's exactly where we go after understanding how the Bible was an instrument of power. When Constantine looked at Christianity, he didn't just see an emerging faith, saw an opportunity. Unifying a vast and fragmented empire was a monumental task, and religion seemed to be the perfect glue. But to do so, he needed a faith that spoke the same language, that followed the same rules, and, above all, that left no room for divergences. The Bible, in this context, became much more than a holy book. It became a tool of power. And the most ironic? The same text that preaches humility and love for others was used to consolidate thrones and silence voices. Under Constantine's influence, Christianity was shaped to meet the needs of the state. Texts that promoted obedience to authorities gained prominence, while others that could encourage questioning were left aside. A notable example is the passage from Romans 13, which exhorts the faithful to submit to governmental authorities. Coincidence? Unlikely. This choice of text fit perfectly with Constantine's vision for a stable and obedient empire. And here's the curious detail. Who could question this narrative when it came with the seal of divine approval? Political and religious power became inseparable allies, and the Bible was the contract that sealed this alliance. But this union did not come without cost. Texts that presented alternative interpretations or challenged the central role of the church were quickly excluded. The Gospel of Mary, which highlights the role of women in spiritual leadership, was seen as a direct threat to the patriarchal structure that the church and state wanted to preserve. And what about the Gospel of Judas, which portrayed Judas as Jesus' confidant, not a traitor? Texts like these were dangerous because they challenged the single narrative that supported power. We cannot ignore the role of translations in this process. The Latin Vulgate, for example, was one of the first official versions of the Bible, translated by Jerome at the request of the church. This text unified the Christian message, but also eliminated nuances present in other versions and languages. In many translations, terms have been softened or adjusted to reinforce the power of church and state. The words that have come down to us are a carefully filtered interpretation, shaped to serve a specific agenda. The sarcasm here is almost irresistible. The word sacred has become synonymous with strategically convenient. What is most intriguing, and perhaps disturbing, is that the alliance between church and state not only shaped the Bible, but also determined who had access to it. For centuries, reading the Bible was restricted to clergy, while the common people had to rely on its interpretations. This created a monopoly on knowledge, where the Word of God was delivered to the public only through the filter of the church. Forbidden knowledge was available to everyone, but few could touch it. It was such an effective control that even today, many do not question the origins and intentions behind the sacred text. And so, the Bible became not only a spiritual guide, but also a political weapon. But to understand what this means, we need to turn our attention to what was left out. The excluded texts not only present new perspectives, but also expose the limits of the official narrative. Let's explore these lost stories and the impact of their exclusion, opening doors to knowledge that still resists censorship. Imagine an ancient library full of parchments and manuscripts, each telling a different story about spirituality and existence. Now imagine doors being closed, books being locked, and, eventually, burned. This was the fate of many texts excluded from what we know today as the Bible. They were not erased for lack of value, but because they carried ideas that challenged the status quo. Each lost gospel, each forgotten letter, represents an alternative vision of the divine, a vision that was deemed too dangerous to survive. One of the most fascinating texts is the Gospel of Mary, which presents Mary Magdalene as a central figure in Jesus' circle, not just a follower, but a spiritual leader with her own teachings. It is impossible not to question, why was such a rich narrative erased? The answer is as old as human history: control. A text that placed a woman in a position of spiritual leadership was a direct threat to the male hierarchy that dominated church and state. By excluding Mary Magdalene, not only was her story silenced, but also the potential for a more inclusive spirituality. Another controversial text is the Gospel of Judas, which completely turns the traditional narrative on its head. In it, Judas is not the traitor, but the most faithful disciple, chosen by Jesus to fulfill the most difficult role of all. This text not only challenges the idea of betrayal, but also raises profound questions about the meaning of sacrifice and redemption. No wonder it was labeled heretical and banned. After all, if Judas was not the villain, how can we explain centuries of doctrine based on guilt and repentance? This is the kind of occult knowledge that continues to be pursued even today. And then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered only in the 20th century. These texts, hidden for centuries, reveal a Judaism much more diverse and complex than previously imagined. They show that faith in the Second Temple period was not a straight line, but a tangle of ideas and practices. Some of these writings speak of imminent apocalypses, while others present mystical interpretations of the Torah. What is most intriguing is how these ideas influenced early Christianity. But as always, views that didn't fit the official narrative were left behind. But if you want to know more about the Dead Sea Scrolls, leave it in the comments and I can make a video just about these manuscripts. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe, as we're just at the beginning and getting back to the video. The The Gospel of Thomas is another example of a text that offers a unique perspective on Jesus. Instead of focusing on miracles and historical events, it presents Jesus as a teacher who offers enigmatic and timeless wisdom. It's almost as if Jesus was more interested in teaching the secrets of self-knowledge than in creating a new religion. But this mystical and introspective vision did not sit well with church leaders, who preferred a more concrete and controllable approach. Thus, Thomas was excluded, and his message became yet another victim of censored knowledge. These excluded texts invite us to question what else may have been lost over the centuries. They not only challenge the official narrative, but also remind us that spirituality is much bigger than any book or institution. And as we delve deeper into this journey, it is impossible not to reflect on what the creation of this absolute truth really meant. Because for every story that was included, there is another that was left behind, waiting to be rediscovered. The idea that the Bible represents absolute truth is for many a foundation of faith. But what few know is that this truth did not come ready. It was built, a meticulous construction, made of human choices, heated debates, and of course, political concessions. Imagine a mosaic where each piece was carefully selected to form a cohesive image, but also to hide what didn't fit. The unification of biblical texts was a process that prioritized authority and stability over diversity and inclusion. The result? A solid narrative, but full of gaps. The official truth we know today began to take shape in councils, but was reinforced over the centuries by leaders who understood the power of a single story. When the church consolidated its canon, it not only chose the text that would be included, it also defined how these texts should be interpreted. Any alternative reading was labeled heresy, and dissenters were persecuted. The sarcasm here is inevitable. A text that preaches spiritual freedom was used to silence those who dared to think differently. This absolute truth was not just spiritual. It was a tool to control minds and hearts. Consider the impact of this unification on the collective imagination. For centuries, people believed that the Bible was a direct revelation from God, without questioning how it was shaped. And why would they question? The idea that the sacred text could be manipulated was inconceivable. But now we know that the Bible is not a pure reflection of the divine word. It is a mirror of the human hands that shaped it. This does not diminish its spiritual importance, but it invites us to look at it with new eyes that recognize the excluded knowledge that still echoes in the shadows. This unique narrative also had practical consequences. By excluding texts that presented alternative views, the church not only consolidated its power, but also limited the potential for spiritual inquiry and growth. The Gospel of Mary, with its valorization of the female role, could have transformed the position of women in society. The Gospel of Judas, with its revolutionary vision of sacrifice, could have challenged the concepts of guilt and redemption. In creating an absolute truth, much was left behind, and the cost of that choice is still felt today. Most fascinating, and perhaps disturbing, is that the creation of this absolute truth was not a one-time event. It was a continuous process which continues to the present day. Each translation, each interpretation, each theological debate is another layer in this mosaic. And as we look at what was lost, it's impossible not to wonder, what else could be hidden? This question leads us to the crucial reflection of this journey, where we will explore what this all means for us today and how we can reconnect with knowledge that has been excluded, censored, and persecuted. Now that we know how the Bible was constructed, an inevitable question arises. What does this mean for our faith, for our spirituality, and for ourselves? Understanding that the sacred text was shaped by human hands should not diminish its value, but enrich our relationship with it. After all, faith is not something that can be contained by words on a scroll. On the contrary, it is something that transcends the limitations of history. But to do that, we need to be willing to question. And questioning is often the first step to understanding hidden knowledge. that which has been left aside, but which still pulses, waiting to be rediscovered. The exclusion of texts, such as the Gospel of Mary or Jude, leaves us with an important lesson. Spirituality is much greater than any institution or official narrative. These lost texts not only challenge what we believe we know, but invite us to explore new possibilities. What could we learn from Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader? What if Judas was not a traitor, but the most faithful of all the disciples? These questions don't have simple answers, but that's exactly why they're so powerful. They remind us that the search for truth is above all a personal journey. Looking at the story of the Bible, we see a reflection of humanity, full of contradictions, but also of beauty. The creation of an absolute truth was an attempt to make sense of a chaotic world. But the price of this attempt was high. Texts were deleted, voices were silenced, and ideas were suppressed. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. And perhaps the biggest lesson is this: the truth is not in one place. It's everywhere, scattered like fragments of a broken mirror, waiting for us to have the courage to put the pieces together. What about our relationship with the Bible today? Knowing that it was shaped by human choices, we can approach it with a new sense of curiosity and respect. Not as an immutable truth, but as a guide that reflects both the divine and the human. This does not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it makes it richer, because by recognizing your limitations, we also recognize your potential. The Bible is not just a sacred text. It is a gateway to a deeper search for the meaning of life. A journey that begins when we stop accepting everything without question. So what do we do with this knowledge? This is the question that each of us needs to answer. Are you willing to explore what has been deleted, censored, and persecuted? Are you ready to question the narratives you have been taught? If the answer is yes, you won't just be learning about the Bible. You will be learning about yourself. And that is the greatest mystery of all, the journey within, where the true sacred has always been. And to help you in this search, subscribe to the channel as we will cover each text that was deleted. Not just those that were mentioned, but many others that tried to be erased from history. Thank you very much for staying here, and until the next video.